When you think of today's NFL, you probably think 32 teams, neatly packaged into their separate divisions and conferences. But it wasn't always that way. Starting in the 1920s and moving into the modern era, 49 franchises are now defunct, meaning they started, played at least one season, and at some point shut down forever. In fact, only 2 of the original 12 teams still exist, the Chicago Bears and the Arizona Cardinals. Today, we'll take a look at 10 of the most interesting defunct teams, why they disbanded, and how some big names scraped through the river of mud to come out clean on the other side. Be sure to let us know which teams you want to learn more about, or what teams we left off the list. We'll begin with one of the best-known defunct teams, the Steagles. No, I didn't misspeak. The Steagles were a joint team created out of necessity during World War II. Created for the 1943 season, the Philadelphia Eagles and the Pittsburgh Steelers were both facing player shortages due to the war effort. For the Eagles players, it was great, because they hadn't seen a winning record since 1933. Playing half their games at Pittsburgh's Forbes Field and half at Philadelphia's Shibe Park, the Steagles opted to go the co-coaching route. Yep, no way that could go poorly. The Eagles' Greasy Neal and Steelers' Walt Keasley were a powder keg of a combo, often bringing practice to a halt with their fiery arguments. Remember too, the players still around for the Steagles were those who couldn't pass their military physicals, so how they went 5-4-1 that season is a miracle in and of itself. The Steagles even tapped Hall of Famer Bill Hewitt to help, who came out of retirement for the season, cursed like a sailor, and smoked cigarettes on the field. While they started with a bang, shutting out the Brooklyn Dodgers 17-0 and holding them to negative 33 yards rushing, the rest of the season was a blurry mess. And following the season, the two teams split back to their respective parts of Pennsylvania. After the split, the Steelers joined up with the Chicago Cardinals to form the Carr Pits. Of the Carr Pits, Steelers owner Art Rooney said, "That was the worst team ever. How there's not a movie about the Steagles yet is beyond us." Next up is the Providence Steamrollers. Founded in 1916, these Steamrollers played in the NFL from 1925 to 1931. The Steamrollers may be one of the first instances of Moneyball-type owners, with players' wages set at one of the lowest around the country. Sneaking college players in under aliases, the Steamrollers steamrolled the competition in the 1928 season, winning the championship. The following year, the Steamrollers made NFL history as the first team to ever play 4 games in a 6-day period. Try getting that past the NFLPA today. During that stretch, they also played the first night game in NFL history at Kinsley Park in Providence, Rhode Island. The Great Depression helped seal the demise for the team, and they disbanded in 1931. By today's standards, a 5-foot 5-inch quarterback would not be a likely draft pick, but the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets had great success behind a man of that size named Harry Two Bits Homan. The Yellow Jackets really got rolling after the addition of player-coach Guy Chamberlain, a former standout for the Cleveland Bulldogs. More on that later. Chamberlain helped propel the Yellow Jackets to a 15-1-0 record in 1926, earning Frankfurt the championship as well as setting an NFL record for regular season victories that stood until 1984. Keeping with the tradition of firsts, the Yellow Jackets were the first team in the NFL to sign a Latino player, Ignacio Molinay. They also frequently held halftime exhibitions that included the first documented game of women's football in 1926. Sweeping to the north, we've got one of the worst defunct teams of all time, sporting 2 seasons with only 1 win, the New York Yanks. The team itself had been in existence since 1944, starting as the Boston Yanks, converting to the Yanks in 1945, then the New York Bulldogs in 1949, to finally land on the New York Yanks for 2 seasons. The 1949 season was a complete disaster, but did feature future Hall of Famer Bobby Lane at quarterback. Lane's only season with the New York Yanks was miserable, but the first time he'd seen real game action. Lane would note later that 1 year with the New York Yanks was worth 5 with any other NFL team. While he left a season later, it was the start of his Hall of Fame career. The Yanks would fold after 2 more seasons, selling back to the league and fading into the sunset. From bottom of the barrel to top of the food chain, we head to Cleveland, home of the Bulldogs? That's right. In 1924, the legendary Canton Bulldogs were struggling financially, so Sam Deutsch, who in the previous year formed the Cleveland Indians, yes, an NFL team, purchased and combined the Canton Bulldogs and Cleveland Indians, renaming them the Cleveland Bulldogs. Early NFL hero Guy Chamberlain led the 1924 Cleveland Bulldogs to a 7-1-1 record. With the best winning percentage that season, the Bulldogs were granted the NFL championship, but not without controversy. The Chicago Bears finished their season 6-1-4 and claimed that they should be declared the winner. The Bears and Bulldogs agreed to a challenge match, with the Bears winning 23-0. But in the following owners' meeting, it was voted that the Bulldogs would be the true NFL champions of the 1924 season. The following season, Guy Chamberlain left for the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets, and the Canton Bulldogs bought their rights back, and the Cleveland Bulldogs withered. That's a few championships now for Guy Chamberlain. But we'd be remiss if, while we're discussing the Canton Bulldogs, we didn't also mention Jim Thorpe. Thorpe's legacy is well known across the sports world, and we have to imagine that some of that greatness wore off on Guy Chamberlain. The Canton Bulldogs were instrumental in a long line of NFL teams, even if they are now defunct. The spirit of Canton, Thorpe, and Chamberlain can still be felt years removed. One last note on Chamberlain. With a 58-16-7 record in 6 years as an NFL head coach, he has the best win percentage at .759 of any coach in NFL history with a minimum 50 wins. Speaking of Canton, Ohio was a hotbed for early NFL teams, and none were finer than the Dayton Triangles. One of the only teams in the NFL to ever have a shape for a name, the Triangles got their name from their home field, Triangle Park. Founded in 1913, the Triangles were an indomitable force, winning the Ohio City Championship in 1913, 1914, and 1915. They didn't post a losing record until 1923, their second year in the recently established NFL. The Triangles went 8-0-0 in 1918, tackling another Ohio League championship, defeating teams like the Toledo Maroons, Hammond Pros, Columbus Panhandles, and Detroit Heralds. 2 years later, the Triangles became a charter team in the American Professional Football Association, joining the ranks of the Canton Bulldogs and APFA president Jim Thorpe. The Triangles and Bulldogs would square off several times over the next few years. The most famous matchup saw the Triangles tie the Bulldogs 20-20 in 1920. The first time any team had put 3 or more touchdowns up against the Bulldogs since 1915. 1922 saw the beginning of the end for the Triangles, as they began to consistently fall below 500, sporting just 5 wins between 1923 and 1929 when they inevitably closed up shop. The Triangles would go through several more iterations in different cities, eventually becoming our next defunct team. You're likely used to hearing about a Texans team in Texas. The Texans in 1952 were based in Dallas. Remember the New York Yanks from earlier in this video? They were sold off in January 1952 to a pair of Texas brothers, the Millers. This was the first attempt in the NFL to start a team in the South. Up until that point, all teams were in the Northeast, with a winless 0-10 start in the season, and with the lowest attendance in the league, the Millers threw in the towel and sold the team back to the NFL with 2 games remaining. The team was moved to Hershey, Pennsylvania to finish out its days. The move by Miller marked the Texans as the last failed team in the NFL. But the Texans weren't done yet. On Thanksgiving Day 1952, the Texans arrived in Akron to face the best team in the league, the George Halas-led Chicago Bears. Seeing the hapless Texans head into the stadium, George Halas made the decision to sit his starters. What ensued was one of the strangest Thanksgiving upsets of all time, with the Texans squeaking out their first and only win of the season on a last-second touchdown to win 27-23. Utterly embarrassing for the Bears. The teams combined for 12 total turnovers in the game, a fitting highlight for a sloppy Texans team. The final game for the Texans was a 41-6 loss to the Detroit Lions, but the Texans' legacy was set. This closes the chaotic loop of defunct teams created by the Dayton Triangles. 7 iterations deep, the Texans sold to Carroll Rosenblum, who used most of the remaining Texans roster to found the NFL's Baltimore Colts. The new Colts team severed all ties to the past, finally putting to rest the saga of the Triangles, Dodgers, Tigers, Yanks, Bulldogs, Yanks, Texans teams before them. Like they say in Game of Thrones, what is dead cannot die. That was definitely true for the Texans. A decade later, the Texans rose from their grave under new ownership and a charter member of the American Football League. While the direct relation to the former Texans is non-existent, the newly formed Texans hired Hank Stram to be their coach. Does that name sound familiar? As the Dallas Texans were getting their feet under them, so too were the Dallas Cowboys. With not enough room in Dallas for 2 professional teams, even though everything's bigger in Texas, owner Lamar Hunt set his eyes on the Midwest and conducted negotiations on the move in secrecy. Finally, in 1963, the Texans moved north to Kansas City, becoming what we know today as the Kansas City Chiefs. If you watched our video on the championship games from this past season or watched the Super Bowl, then you know that the move worked out exceedingly well for Lamar Hunt and Kansas City. Head coach Hank Stram would go on to have a 124, 76, and 10 record, posting 3 championships across his tenure. The Chiefs have since posted 3 Super Bowl wins in 2023, 2020, and 1970. Cementing the decision to leave Texas as a good idea. While we're on the early days of the NFL in the South, we have to touch on the Houston Oilers. Another charter member of the American Football League, the Oilers were owned and operated by, yes, a oil tycoon named Bud Adams. The early years for the Oilers were amazing, with AFL championships in their first 2 seasons, 1960 and 1961. They attempted to repeat in 1962, but lost in, at the time, the longest professional football championship game ever played, a double overtime loss to none other than the soon-to-be-leaving Dallas Texans. Led by future Hall of Famer George Blanda at quarterback, the Oilers were a force to be reckoned with in the AFL. But after joining the NFL in the 70s, the Oilers hit a bit of a losing streak. After drafting Earl Campbell in 1978, the Oilers improved, heading back to the conference championship in both 78 and 79, but losing the wild card in 1980. With more ups and downs over the next few decades, trouble was brewing for Oilers fans. Although the Oilers were well supported, owner Bud Adams wanted a new stadium. Unable to gain approval in Houston, Adams shopped the Oilers around to see if there were any willing buyers. There were, in fact, and at the end of the 1995 season, Bud Adams announced the team would head to Nashville and play their first games there in 1997 as the Tennessee Oilers. They would last one more season, finally finishing their metamorphosis into the Tennessee Titans in 1999. That same year, Houston and soon-to-be owner Robert McNair were awarded an expansion team to the tune of $1 billion. We know that team today as the Houston Texans, but they would not play until 2002. Unlike the next team we'll touch on, the Houston Texans technically have no historical ties to the Houston Oilers as a true expansion team. Speaking of expansion teams, let's jump back to the great state of Ohio. Rewinding 4 years, we head to Cleveland where Art Modell is about to mark the Cleveland Browns as defunct. Founded by Arthur B. McBride in 1944, their first season was played under legendary head coach Paul Brown in 1946. With early success, the Browns were the poster child for what an NFL franchise should look like. But when Art Modell bought the team in 1961, Paul Brown grew tired of the micromanagement of Modell and moved down I-71 to form the Cincinnati Bengals. There really is no man more hated in the city of Cleveland. Just check out the Muck Fodell hats. The Cleveland Browns would have their ups and downs over the next 3 decades, but the real gut punch came in 1995, when Modell announced the Cleveland franchise would be moving to Baltimore. Lawsuits ensued between the NFL, the Browns, and both cities of Cleveland and Baltimore. The result would set a new precedent across the league and save the franchise in Cleveland, while Baltimore would be granted full staff and roster of the then Cleveland Browns. The new Baltimore team would have no further connection to the Browns, and all history of the franchise would stay with Cleveland until they built a new stadium and were reactivated in 1999. Saved from the jaws of being defunct. But with 2 winning seasons since they were reactivated, can we really consider that being saved? So there you have it. Some of the strangest starts and finishes for now defunct teams across the NFL's history. While they may be mostly a memory, the teams were each impactful to the modern-day NFL in their own way. There are plenty more teams we didn't cover, so which ones did we miss? Which do you want to hear more about? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe to make sure you never miss on new content.